Today to talk about is the issue of campus sexual violence and how we can take a whole school approach and what does that actually mean. And so I'm from Rutgers. This is a map of where we are. We are on the Atlantic Ocean. I'm not sure if any of you have been down to New Jersey, but hope that you've had a chance. It has a bad reputation sometimes, but it's actually quite beautiful. You can see that we're along the ocean, the Jersey Shore, as we call it. Rutgers is our state university. So people within New Jersey tend to come to our university, but we actually have students from around the country, from all 50 states and many other countries. And Rutgers is a complicated university because we have 3 different campuses and we are in 3 different cities across the state of New Jersey that you can see here in Newark, New Brunswick, and Camden. And so I think geography is important to think about when we talk about a whole school approach. You know, at Rutgers, does that mean all of these different campuses together? When we talk about the campus community, how do we even define that? Is it the cities we're in? Is it the university as a whole? We know that each campus has its own particular flavor and community as well. So these are some of the challenges that we've tried to think about at Rutgers when we talk about this whole school approach. And I wanted to start with just a little story. The other picture here is called Old Queens, and it's where our president has his office and other senior leadership. It's very beautiful. People always take pictures under this arch. But in 2014, we received a call at my center. I'm at the Center for Research on Ending Violence at the School of Social Work. And we received a call from President Obama was in administration then, and the issue of campus sexual violence was one of his priority areas. And he formed a task force on student campus sexual violence, which some of you have written about, and I know you may be familiar with. And one of the parts of his task force recommendations were to conduct campus climate surveys. And so that task force under President Obama reached out to a few different schools and asked them to partner. And so at Rutgers, we were very excited because they invited us to partner with the Obama task force to pilot test, try out a campus climate survey for our students to really understand what their experiences were like. So of course we wanted to, who gets a call from the White House or, any kind of state official or federal official, and it was very exciting. And of course we wanted to accept. And the university was very excited for us to have this project, and I was asked to lead the project. So it started with a lot of excitement, but then I got this email asking me to come to a meeting at Old Queens, which you see here. And it wasn't very clear why we were having the meeting. But it was sort of implied that there were some concerns about the campus climate survey. And I did not have tenure. I was sort of a newish professor, so I was very nervous going into this meeting. And when I came in, there was a big table and there were lots of people around it that I didn't know, but I did know some of them, the chancellor and some other leaders. And so indeed, they did want to talk about the survey and what it would do. What were the implications for doing this kind of work at the university? We had provided counseling for a long time and some other services, but actually doing a survey, we were going to be finding out what students' experiences were was new for our university. So I was asked to provide, a description of the project, which I did. And then I paused and waited for questions. And the chancellor said, "This sounds like really important work. I support it, and I'm going to open it up for questions to see." And I started to learn that there were people there from legal services. There were people from student affairs. There were people from our ethics and compliance, from communications, and some of them just asked different questions. But then the chancellor turned to one person in particular who said, I'll say his name is Bob. Bob, what were your concerns? Because I know you wanted to have this meeting. And so Bob said, well, what are we going to do if parents find out what we are asking of their students, that we're asking them about these kinds of topics like sexual violence? That's going to be terrible for the university. So there was obviously this concern that came out, and I was thinking about how to reply, and then someone else stepped in and said, well, I think that parents might be really happy to see that we are doing something about this issue at Rutgers, and it's a chance for us to show them that we're listening to what their students are saying. And another person sort of stepped in and agreed. And the point of it being that during this meeting, people came together and actually answered the question for him. I don't know if he ever fully felt okay with it, but they even agreed. Another office, the communications office, said, well, we could come up with a list of talking points in case parents call and have concerns. We'll be prepared, and we can let them know why this work is important and why we're doing it. And so I had gone into the meeting feeling very nervous, but I actually came out having that group of people around the table, realizing it was much stronger having had that conversation. Hearing how different people could contribute. People were saying, well, I can let students know about it through this listserv. I can encourage professors to give students time to take this survey during classes. And so the idea of the whole school approach, right, is like, who is around that table and what roles do they have to play? And the other point I think is that it's messy. You know, it's not always comfortable. Not everybody is going to be on board with it. But one of the things I learned from that experience that I've taken with me is from the beginning of doing any of this work, I think having the people who are concerned at the table from the beginning is actually quite helpful. Because I want to know what their concerns are or what problems they have so that we can deal with it from the beginning and try to get them to buy in. So that started our work in 2014, and we received some funding then because of this project and the survey that we did. We received some funding through our state, and we engaged in a 7-year project, which is in its last year right now. And the project was really to take the data from our campus climate survey and figure out what we could do at Rutgers to do a better job of both preventing and responding to campus sexual violence. And we worked on really building a model, and we used a whole school approach, meaning that it's based on the idea that everybody has a role to play in addressing the climate and to both prevent and respond to sexual violence. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about that today, in terms of what we've tried to do, what's worked, what hasn't worked. And I also look forward to hearing, about what kinds of experiences you all have had. So I think everyone on this call probably already believes that campus sexual violence is a problem. I don't need to convince you all of that. We know that it's widespread, and the research keeps showing, right, that prevalence rates are pretty high, especially for undergraduate women. But we also know undergraduate men and graduate students are affected by this. We also know that people who are non-binary are affected at higher rates. And some of the folks doing this work with you all in Montreal have produced some really important research showing us, again, how sexual and gender minority students are especially affected disproportionately by sexual violence. So we know that it's a problem, and we also know that our efforts really need to be more inclusive. There's been critique of how campus sexual violence and sexual violence more generally has been treated over the years as this separate thing from racism or from genderism. And we know, right, that these need to be better connected in the work that we do if we really want to understand intersectionality. And I know when I was in college, this was sort of the message that we got when people would talk about sexual violence. We had to go to a rape workshop when I was a long time ago in college. But the basic message there for so many years was focused on women, right? Like, think about where you're walking. Don't be a victim. Whatever behavior it is that you're engaging in is the problem. Carry mace. Don't wear your hair in a ponytail because it can get pulled. Don't walk here. Don't do this. Don't do that. Don't leave your friends. Watch your drink. And I think that started to shift a little bit, and people realized, well, most sexual violence is being, it occurs by men, and so we need to be bringing them into the picture. But then a lot of efforts were really like, men, make sure that you're behaving correctly. Don't rape, don't do this, don't do that. And I think that the critique of these approaches on campuses is that no one really wanted to go to these programs. They didn't want to hear the message. They didn't see themselves as either a victim or a perpetrator, so they felt it was not relevant to them. It was, very much based on this binary sort of heteronormative idea that it only occurs with men, perpetrating sexual violence against women. So it left out a lot of people, and it really didn't give people a role to play in trying to address violence. So instead, there's been a call to try to broaden that and figure out, how do we make sexual violence an issue that is something for everybody to be thinking about. And we've seen these ecological models, which are probably familiar to many of you. The Centers for Disease Control put this out. They see sexual violence as a public health problem, and they've said we can't just look at the individual. We can't just look at potential victims and potential perpetrators. We need to look beyond that. We need to look at this expanded view of the person, as we say in social work, the person in their environment, the person, the relationships and their peers around them, the community, and the larger societal norms. And so, on the individual level, we know that there are factors that contribute to sexual violence, characteristics about where it happens and by whom. But we know that there are so many other factors at these other levels that influence not only campus sexual violence happening, but also how we respond to it and the well-being and trajectory of healing for survivors. And these are just a few, of these different levels that we've been told we need to pay better attention to. So again, it's not only about looking ecologically at what puts people at risk for victimization and for perpetration, but also how do we engage people in prevention and response beyond just the individuals who are immediately affected. And so the whole school approach is one way and offers some models to us to be able to do this. And when we were looking at Rutgers for, models of how we could do this behavior and do this work in a way that's more inclusive, we read a lot about whole school approaches, and it's largely been used in the bullying literature. So if you're interested in whole school models, I would definitely recommend that you read some of the work by Dorothy Espelage and others who have tested empirically this idea of a whole school approach. So the whole school approach, it really understands, again, it doesn't focus, for example, on bullying on just the bully and the victim or even their dyad. It goes well beyond that. It looks at different factors and systems. It understands roles of larger factors such as policies, the classroom setting, the teachers, the climate, and sort of how these all interact. The other thing that we really like about whole school models is that they are not deficit-based, they're strengths-based. And so they don't just look at the problematic behaviors, for example, of bullying. Their goals are to build empathy, to increase pro-social action, to build strong relationships, and that is seen as a form of prevention. And Dorothy Espelage and a number of others have conducted research, as I mentioned, that actually provides empirical work that shows that bullying prevention that involves the whole school are more effective than focusing only on potential bullies and or just on victims. But when we think about what does that mean? Okay, so we know that this works with bullying and with some other issues. There's been a little bit of work done on this on dating violence, teen dating violence in high schools, also with research showing that when you can include the whole school, that it's more effective in terms of prevention and outcomes. But when we think about applying that on college campuses, what does that mean? What does that look like? And there hasn't been a whole lot done in looking at this sort of empirically, but I did put 2 articles here that may be of interest to you if you haven't seen them already. They're case studies of institutions of higher education that did use whole school approaches, specifically looking at sexual violence. And there was a lot that we took from their models about how to do this work, what worked well, what didn't. And so I would encourage you to check that out if it's of interest. And so when we take that whole school approach that we learned about from bullying in high schools, and we think about it on college campuses and the issue of campus sexual violence, what does it mean? Who can we really engage in this work? And when we talk about whole school, what exactly does that even mean? And so we've talked about whole school being a mindset and a framework where it means that we're engaging everybody. Everybody has a role to play. And it also is a process. It's a way that we try to engage everybody on the campus in understanding this as a community-based issue. So again, it's both a framework and it's also a process that guides the work. And these are some of the different groups on campus that can be engaged. Some have been already, I think, in ways that are pretty effective, but others have been less so. And so at Rutgers, we've been trying to pay attention to these different levels. But the whole school approach also is not just about sort of the sum of all these different groups. It's how do you also bring all of this together in a way that's really synthesized and holistic. So what I'd like to do is just share a few different examples of some research and work that we've done at these different levels. And the first one is student and peers. Again, we're moving beyond just the individual being affected and thinking about what other roles are there for people on campus. And I think the role of students and peers has probably, out of all of those different groups, received the most attention so far, other than the individual, in the literature and probably on programs when we think about peer education programs and education programs, for example. We know that peers have a very, very important role to play. I personally think, in the research that I've done over the years, that the role of peers is so central to trying to both respond to and prevent sexual violence. College students at the age that they are developmentally, their peers have influence on them in ways that administrators don't. I have a son who's in college right now. If I tell him something's really great, like I eat more lettuce and salads, he doesn't hear me. But last week he was with his friends at college and he told me he had a big old salad, and it was because he was with his friends and they thought that it was really delicious. So, right, like they're gonna listen to their peers in a way that they don't listen to adults or others. And so there's so much research out there showing that when somebody does experience dating violence, sexual violence, other problems, if they share it with anybody, it's most likely going to appear. And so even with all these programs and offices that we have on our campuses, they're not used to the same extent that peers are. They're the ones who are receiving disclosures. And in some of the campus climate work we did, we found in our study that 20% of our sample said they had received at least one disclosure. Many received more. And this is just about sexual violence. And those who experienced sexual violence and told someone, 77% of them said that they had told a friend or a peer. And we know that also there's a whole body of research on social reactions, and the way that we react to somebody telling us about their disclosure is huge. Sarah Ullman's work has looked at this, and a positive reaction can really make that person feel supported. But actually, even more powerfully, a negative reaction can be incredibly destructive for that person, with self-blame, with their trajectory for healing. So how the person reacts is just so important. And I think this is an area that is really important for us to continue to explore. We also found that even though most people disclose to a peer, a lot of peers don't know how to respond, or they think they're responding in a helpful way and it's actually not, or they don't really know what they're supposed to do after that. So there are all these sort of, dots that need to be connected. The other thing is that research is showing us that students from marginalized groups have tended to receive even more negative reactions, especially from more formal organizations too. And so we need to be, thinking about that as we're teaching people how to respond to these disclosures. Another study we did interviews with survivors and asked them, like, what was helpful actually? Part of my area is bystander intervention. I think it's important for us to be teaching people to intervene, but we don't always ask survivors on the other end, like, was that actually helpful when the person stepped in, or did it make things worse or better? So we asked survivors these questions, and one of the themes that came across really clearly was they felt most supported when they disclosed to a peer and the peer was supportive to them, either in the words that they provided, or offering them support, or telling them it wasn't their fault, or offering to go somewhere with them, giving them options. We have a number of offices on campus at Rutgers that have been around since 1991 that are confidential, anonymous, free for our students to come and if they experience any form of sexual violence. But students don't always know about it and they don't always come. And what we found through this study was that students were more likely to use the services on campus if they disclosed it to a peer and the peer encouraged them to go to the services on campus, and sometimes also offered to go with them or make the appointment. And so I think this idea of just how can peers learn how to do this type of referral and work is really important. Again, we found though that many of our students didn't know how to respond. So because of this, we started a program at Rutgers called Rutgers Cares. Everything at Rutgers is RU. So we have an RU Cares program. As you can see, it says creating allies to provide resources and empower survivors. And so the whole point of this program was designed on this data that we have that shows that students don't always know how to react to disclosures from their peers. And so it teaches students, first of all, about what is sexual violence and dating violence, what kinds of ways are normal for a trauma survivor to respond, because we've heard students say things like, well, they weren't yelling or they didn't fight back, so I'm not really sure if this was or not. So we try to explain what happens in the brain with trauma and people freezing and all of the sort of neuroscience pieces to it. But we also then talk about and have them practice actually, what do you do if someone says something like this to you? How can you be supportive to them? And so we've done a little bit of evaluation of this program. So far, we've already trained 3,000 students over the last 3 years. And our initial evaluation shows that students felt increased confidence in being able to support a peer and also refer them to services on campus. We're going to be evaluating it this year again with a pre-test, a post-test, and then we're going to do a quick pulse survey with them about 6 months later to say, did you get to use any of these skills while you were, after being in the program? Like, did anybody disclose to you and what happened? Because we want to hear about, what happened afterwards. The other thing that this program brings up is that we ask a lot of peers, supporting a friend who has experienced sexual violence or dating violence is a lot. And sometimes someone does try to intervene or be supportive and it doesn't work, or it makes them feel stressed out, or it brings up their own trauma, or they've tried multiple times and they don't know what to do. And so we also need to figure out, how do we provide support to the supporters, to the peers and the people who are receiving these disclosures. So we're adding a component to this program to really figure out, how do we make sure that those students are also cared for and know that support is available to them It's not only if you've been victimized, but it's secondary trauma, and it's that you can use the services on campus to call and say, I don't know what to do. How should I move forward? So that's a part of what we're testing out now as well. So beyond, providing responses to disclosures, there are so many other roles for students and peers in this whole school approach where we're really engaging people. Other fields that use whole school approaches really put students at the core. And they argue that students are not only the recipients of education, so they're not only going and attending these programs, but they have such more, there's a way to really be so much more active. They can be helping to, deliver what these programs look like. We need them to tell us what works and what doesn't work. And peer education is one way to do that. They can also take leadership roles in helping design the curriculum and different programs or events. We've seen so much student activism on these issues. I know in both of our countries over the last few years and even around the world. And I don't know that campuses are yet well connected between like the institutional leadership and student activists. And I think there are ways that we can better have them work together, right? Where we can harness and use some of that activism to inform policies and real decision making on campus. But so we have an advisory board at Rutgers on issues of interpersonal violence, and we have students sit at that board. So that idea again of who's at that table, when I first went to that meeting that I told you about, there were not students sitting there at that time. But we now have an advisory board that meets regularly and includes students, and that perspective is so important. The pictures that we have here are about the surveys that we were doing, the campus climate surveys, and we asked students what they thought about it. And they thought that, again, their peers would listen to them differently than they listen to others. And so they came up with this idea to have a campaign where different student leaders would write down why they were going to participate in campus in the survey, and why it's important for student voices to be heard. And so we had the president of the student body and other student leaders participate and take pictures and really become involved. And so that's just an example, but I think that there are, so many ways we can involve students in taking leadership. And then I think, we've done some research that has also showed us, though, that some students feel like they are not included in prevention and education efforts in the same way. We specifically met with Black students, students who had minoritized gender identities, and students with disabilities who said that they feel that sometimes the prevention programs do not speak to them because they are only focused on sexual violence or dating violence, and they don't talk about this larger context of oppression and racism. And so we've been working really hard to shift our bystander intervention programs at Rutgers to be more social justice based, where they don't talk just about one form of violence. They talk about how they are interconnected and how that impacts people's choices, right? If we are telling certain students to call the police if they see something, the trust is not there for certain groups because of how they've been treated by the police over the years due to racism. And so having these aspects woven in together and doing this work and having students represented from a variety of backgrounds and identities, I think is extremely important if we want to be effective and able to reach, folks beyond who we have been. Faculty and staff, when we're thinking about the whole school approach, again, in the bullying literature, teachers and staff have like a really important role to play, right? We can think about that in an elementary school or secondary school, that the teacher can see when bullying's happening in their classroom, they can model behaviors. And we haven't really thought about this as much when it comes to campus sexual violence. What is the role of faculty and staff? In the United States, a lot of the conversation has been around if you're a mandated reporter. So if a student says that they experience sexual violence or they write it in an assignment, are you mandated to then report that? And that has been a big debate. But we know that there are so many other ways that faculty and staff can be involved. And there have been a few people who have written about it. Graham wrote an article with a whole team in 2018, and some of the ideas that they had gathered from focus groups are here about different ways that faculty and staff can be involved. Through some of the work that we did with students, we heard that there were microaggressions that happen a lot of times in classrooms, and faculty instructors don't do anything. They don't step in, and that's a missed opportunity to really model how do you intervene in a pro-social way? How do you try to build a respectful classroom? Sometimes it's the faculty and staff themselves who are committing the microaggression, and that's, you know, an issue that we need more attention to, especially given the power dynamic with students. The same idea of how we respond to disclosures that we talked about related to students also applies to faculty members, and how they respond if a student feels courageous enough to share that with a faculty member, knowing how do you respond, and that it's so important that you respond in a way that is supportive. That's a lot of what the training is that we do at Rutgers, because we heard from survivors that they had mixed experiences. Sometimes faculty would say, no, don't say anything else. If you say anything else, I'm going to have to report it. And that just, you know, cuts off somebody who's trying to share something that's so important in their lives, a trauma, and trying to seek assistance. So we've been trying to build in some training on how do you respond in a way that's supportive. In our syllabi, we now have statements about where students can go for assistance if they're experiencing any of these forms of interpersonal violence. And you can see lots of different other ways here that faculty can be involved. One of the things I wanted to mention is that we have a program at Rutgers that's called Don't Cancel Class. VPVA, which you'll see in this little illustration here, is our Violence Prevention Victim Assistance Office. And they have offered to any faculty member, whether you're in the social sciences and psychology, or you're in mathematics, or something that's not related to sexual violence at all, that if you need to cancel class because you're going to a conference or whatever reason, instead of canceling class, they will come to your class and they will tie the issues of sexual violence prevention to your topic, no matter what it is, whether it's an art class, a math class. They'll talk about the economics of violence and what it costs. They will, you know, and ultimately they're trying to increase awareness about the resources on campus and encourage this idea of a whole school approach, that all students and everyone has a role to play, no matter what your major is. And people love the program. So students probably wish the class was canceled, but they usually let them out early anyway, and it gives just an opportunity, you know, to continue this dialogue. We also, just 2 years ago, started a faculty coalition, and this was because of the very question we're posing today. How do you engage faculty and convince them that this is an issue that is relevant to all of us, and what can we be doing? And so this was the ad that they sent out to try to get faculty to come together and figure out how we can better address this together. And the priorities right now for the coalition, which is in its second year, are to recruit more faculty, to do outreach and communication, to figure out what it means to have a trauma-informed and supportive classroom. So they are offering workshops for other faculty on how to have a trauma-informed classroom. And they are reviewing the policies at Rutgers related to sexual violence, dating violence, and other forms of harm and oppression, to see where they can advocate for change and use their status as tenured faculty members to really try to influence change. Of course, there are faculty members doing research, and being able to involve students in that is also, you know, really important, and something that faculty members can do as well. Staff are not always thought of right away as having the same role as faculty, but the picture here is actually when we presented our campus climate data findings, the Division of Student Affairs at Rutgers. So that includes anyone involved in student programming, residence life, dining services, recreation, health services, anything there. It's a very large division, anything that serves students. And the director of the division said, let's have this data presented to everybody. And we weren't really sure how it was going to go, because some people were very clearly, invested in this and wanted to make change. And other people, we weren't sure, like, well, I don't know what dining services is going to think of this. And I have to say, it was one of my favorite experiences in presenting the data. And we did it together with somebody from Student Affairs, and they put the challenge out to say, now that you've heard about some of these key findings of what's happening, now we're challenging you all to think about how this is relevant to your area. And they gave them time and donuts and coffee, to come up with ideas and then present it back to the group. And they had amazing ideas about raising awareness, about putting information in the bathroom stalls about where, victim services were available, so that if somebody was in there and they had a private moment, that they could see that information right there in the gyms. That, they could put information in the on the tables in dining services. Some of the folks said, like in financial services, financial aid, that they wanted to train the rest of the staff, because they said sometimes they do hear people arguing or coming to them with a situation where they can see that there's tension, and they're not sure how to intervene or if they should be. And so this resulted in some more training for faculty and staff to engage in bystander intervention. We also then, because of these results, we hired somebody full-time to do training for faculty and staff on these issues. And so over the last 2 years, she's trained just under 3,000 faculty and staff. And I'm going to come back to that. We are launching our first faculty staff campus climate survey in 2 weeks. I'm very nervous. I'm in charge of it. It's for like 22,000 faculty and staff across all of Rutgers about their experiences with harassment. But our president and our chancellors are on board. We have working groups in place, and they're going to be charged with coming up with an action plan. Because we know it's not only about how faculty and staff support students, right? It's about the experiences they may have with each other in their own departments, with different forms of sexual violence and harassment. So we need to make sure that we're providing that level of support too. So all of this stuff is really great, but with all of the aspects, it's always messy. And so when I was talking with the trainer about what her experience has been with doing these trainings, because it's impressive, right, to see that she's trained 3,000 people, she said, this is what usually comes up when she starts her training, is that people are fairly resistant to it. And these are some of the comments she said that she hears a lot. People don't want another training. People feel like it's all about this sensitivity stuff and they've already had enough. They already participated in something else. And so, she finds it really, really challenging, the time. And so she is trying to create and work with a partner who's going to do a train the trainer, where faculty and staff are going to be working on a bystander program, and they will be trying to recruit and bring in their peers. Not that that's going to be the solution for everything, but just as one other way to try to get this training accomplished. Okay, so again, we're just thinking about these different levels, right? And I am more and more convinced that institutional leadership can really make or break it for an institution. We know that its leaders have a really critical role to play. There were a bunch of studies that happened over the last few years that showed that students felt this sense that their institutions were not responding well to them under Title IX. And there were many lawsuits, and the Department of Education here in the US got involved in listing out institutions that had fines and were not being compliant with what's expected for institutions to respond. We've seen high profile cases like Dr. Larry Nassar at Michigan State University, and other places where there have been like widespread failures of the institution. So we can have all the bystander intervention programs in the world and train peers to disclose, but if the top leadership is not bought into this, it's probably not going to succeed in the way that it could. And some of you may also be familiar with the work that Jennifer Freed has done on institutional betrayal and institutional courage. And we think it's just such a useful model. When I make presentations to senior leadership at the university, I always am using these models, and it seems like something they really can relate to. This idea that, institutional betrayal has been documented as a way that influences students' perceptions of the university and their willingness to use services, and it contributes to their trauma. It exacerbates their trauma if their institution doesn't respond in ways that are helpful. We know it's not just universities, it's sports team organizations, it's places of worship, etc., different institutions that either they fail to prevent the abuse, they don't respond to it fairly, they lack transparency in what they do, they cover up sometimes, or they have misinformation. They might punish victims themselves or whistleblowers or people who are reporting it, and that all of this really contributes to a terrible experience and environment. But what Jennifer Freed talks about is the opposite, which is institutional courage. And it was funny because one of the leaders at my university is relatively new and didn't sort of know a whole lot about this area, but listened to a talk that Jennifer Freed gave about institutional courage. And during it, he texted me and he's like, "This is great. We need to be doing this." And now I've heard him speak to other leaders at the university, and he uses this phrase a lot, of institutional courage, because it really, talks about going beyond compliance, being able to respond well. And one of the quotes that I have from Jennifer's work is, "It's an institution's commitment to seek the truth and engage in moral action despite unpleasantness, risk, and short-term cost." And that reminded me of that initial conversation I had around the table, where it is messy for an institution to take this on. We know that the survey we're doing in a few weeks with our faculty and staff, it's going to show high rates of harassment, because we know there are high rates of harassment. So it's going to be messy and uncomfortable, but it's the reality. And fortunately, at Rutgers, there's an agreement that we need to do this, and then we need to be able to respond to it. And I think things are changing enough in our culture and our society that people want that level of accountability, rather than just kind of putting their heads in the sand and pretending they don't know about this. But being able to have those conversations, which we've had now at Rutgers about our upcoming survey, include, like, what are we going to do with those results? How are we going to talk about them? How is it going to affect public relations? And those are all somewhat difficult conversations, but we've been having them. And so I think that, that's the important part. And I think institutional commitment comes through to the community as well. Like, they want to see that their leaders are invested in these issues, and it comes through communications and messaging. It comes through transparency. So, for example, we put all of our campus climate findings up on the website so anyone can see them. And some people were uncomfortable with that, but everyone eventually agreed to it. They're also then, right, you need to have, like, if you're saying that you are someone who doesn't tolerate abuse, or that you want to build an environment that's safe, you have to have the policies and the procedures there. And you also need to put money towards it and resources. And so this is, I love this bus. We have it on campus. It came after our campus climate survey. The university agreed that they wanted to increase students and the community's awareness of services on campus. So this was the slogan about supporting, preventing, and speaking. And so they put this on, like, all of our buses at Rutgers, because we're such a large campus. We use buses to get people from classes. But it was just an example of, again, putting money and communications and starting to set norms on campus, that this is something that we talk about. One of our presidents also wrote an op-ed, which he published about these issues. And we've invited some prominent speakers. We had Joe Biden a few years ago come and talk about the Violence Against Women Act, which he had authored. But I mean, how do you get senior leaders to want to do this? And when you have a champion, that's always the best, right? It makes it so much easier. Several years ago, we had somebody at Rutgers who this was so important to her, and it was her line of work, and it was very easy. There was I didn't need to persuade her, no one else did, but that's not always the case. The University of Colorado article that I shared with you before by Cisneros, they talk about this idea of coaching up, where people who do have this experience on campus as practitioners or as researchers really try to share that information up the chain to senior leaders. So, for example, our victim services office, when we got a new president, they invited the president to come meet with survivors. And it was very powerful for him. He heard stories and their experiences, and I think it had a real impact on him. So, how do we connect these different people on campus to make sure that people have this on their radar? There are lots of working groups. Sometimes working groups do nothing, but if you can get a really good group of people together, I think that might come out of, for example, our faculty coalition. They can raise awareness, they can get on agendas and really try to make sure that senior leaders know how important this issue is. And I think being clear on what we're asking of our senior leaders as well. There are also some standards out there now in the United States. We have the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. We have the AAU. They're both groups that are very well respected, and they've come out with statements and they've had training on these issues. And it seems that some of our senior leaders really pay attention to that in a different way. So for example, I have the note here that last spring they had a training for senior leaders specifically on sexual harassment. And so our president and 4 of our other senior vice presidents participated in that. And it was designed specifically for senior leaders about how important their role is. So if there's any way to encourage them or just even talk about what peer institutions are doing, that sometimes that can be the nudge that's needed for that institutional courage. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to finish up. Community partners. What do we mean by community? Is it the geographic location where the actual university is? How can we do better with institutions of higher education and community partners working together? It can be local community organizations. So where our office is in New Brunswick, we have a New Brunswick Domestic Violence Awareness Coalition in the town, in the city, and it's many different community organizations that work together to try to address domestic violence. And this photo is from 2 weeks ago, and so Rutgers was there and gave one of the keynotes, and we had our students go and participate in their march and meet these other organizations. And that feels like a really important relationship for all of us to have. There are regional networks, right? And I know in Montreal, you all have a nice example of how different institutions can work together for this. I've actually brought up the work that you all are doing when I'm talking about it here in the US. There are also lots of students who don't want to seek services on campus, and they may feel more comfortable with confidentiality going to a service that's off campus. But we don't always talk to each other. So, how can we better make those connections? And one of the committees I was on suggested that we have memorandums of understanding, like an agreement between local agencies and institutions for providing services to students off campus, if that's something that they're more comfortable with. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention that I thought was really cool, some of the folks in Toronto are doing this work related to bars and local restaurants and clubs where students go that aren't technically on campus, but we know that's where sexual violence happens. And so doing training for local bars and other staff, because they are in a real position, if we think about this community approach, to see some of these situations happening right in front of them where they can potentially intervene or stop giving drinks, or somehow provide an important intervention. So it's the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, which is doing some really cool work, Catherine Graham and Samantha Wells. So just in concluding, we've learned a lot from this process. Again, it's been super messy at times. Collaboration is so important. It's really the pillar, I would say, of taking this approach. But it takes time. We have to set up meetings and make space and time for each other, and everyone has busy schedules. So building in time for that is really important. We also, again, this idea that we have to support the supporters. So if we're asking people to be involved and supportive, they may bring their own issues that then need to be supported. And we need to be able to provide, for example, services to faculty and staff as well, who may be experiencing this. Continuing to de-silo the work. So it's not like we deal with racism here, we deal with sexual violence here, we deal with alcohol here. Now, how do we work together in a more synthesized way? And resources, I think, are a reality, and it's not just money, it's time and person power and having access to decision making. And on that note, for us, as our grant is ending, we need to figure out how are we going to sustain some of these efforts. We've seen leadership come and go and change, and so it's doing that coaching up again in different ways. And also, because I'm a researcher, need to end with the idea of assessment. Like, the whole school approach sounds great. We've seen anecdotally that it's great, but does it work? Does it actually make things better? Does it make a difference, and in what way and for who? And so I think for all of you here who are researchers, these are really interesting and important questions that we can ask. Okay, so I know I've been talking for a long time, and I just want to thank you all for having me and letting me share a little bit about our experience at Rutgers. I want to give some thank yous for hosting me today, and for different people at Rutgers who have contributed in different ways to this. We know, right, that this work definitely takes a whole team and a village. So I wanted to acknowledge their contributions. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I believe that we'll have a chance now to have some discussion and questions and answers.